interested in moral questions here in this talk. So I'm going to say something about the legality of some of this stuff, but I'm really primarily going to be focused on moral ideas, moral concerns. Let me just say a little bit about some of the terms that are going to be the more contemptful terms that I'm going to refer to in this talk. Membership. Here I'm going to be talking about citizens and all residents as well. So green card holders, HB1 visas, all those, whether permanent or through student and work visas, are all considered members. Okay, and that's because there's a kind of background view about what makes people a member of what makes a person a member of a society. That's not always the same as what makes a person a citizen of a society. Immigration concerns to those people who want to come here to be members. Okay, they want some kind of residence here. Again, whether temporary or permanent. So immigration doesn't refer to people seeking to travel or visit. Discretionary immigrants. Now, there are a lot of people around the world that are in dire straits. They're living in incredibly, severely impoverished circumstances. Their basic human rights are at stake. They are persecuted for various religious or political reasons, sometimes enslaved. They're living in just horrendous, sometimes natural disaster sorts of conditions, but often also political, social, and economic conditions. A lot of the people that are concerned with these issues that I'm going to be talking about today already think that if somebody is living in those kinds of circumstances overseas, then they have some kind of presumptive right. They have some kind of claim to be admitted into our society. They have some kind of moral claim on us. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the people who aren't living in urgent circumstances. They don't have any dire needs that need to be met. They're just people that for various sorts of professional, social, cultural, economic, political, maybe even religious reasons, they want to migrate to a different society. I think it's much harder to say something about those people and what their claims might be to get into a different society than it is to talk about the people who are really urgently needing to move someplace else. And so that's going to be the focus of what I'm going to talk about today. Now, just talking about discretionary immigrants, okay, this is what I mean, people who don't have urgent claims to come into our society. Just talking about discretionary immigrants, what are our obligations as a society to allow them to come in? Okay, so some of you are going to be familiar with an open border, closed border debate in some of your international or politics classes, or maybe even some of your economics courses. The talk is going to center on a lot of the similar sorts of ideas that you're going to find in that debate. Just focusing the attention or the focus or the concern to discretionary immigrants, what are our obligations to allow them to come in? Most people, most political philosophers, and maybe political theorists, and a lot of just public commentators think, you know what, we don't have to allow any of those people in. It's our right as a sovereign state to simply close our doors to everybody. So if you don't have an urgent claim to be let in, then we don't have to let you in. And France doesn't have to let us in to their society if we don't have urgent claims. Or the UK doesn't have to let us in. And Pakistan doesn't have to let us in, although you might not want to go to Pakistan. I'm originally from Pakistan, so I'm making light of it, but it's actually a beautiful country, and there's a lot there to want to go see. When it comes to discretionary immigrants, most political philosophers and public commentators are going to say, they have no claim on us. Okay, we can just close our doors and not admit any of them. Okay, so given that that's the view, then it's going to be especially hard to try to isolate what might be wrong with implementing any kind of religious or racial or national or ethnic bans on people. Because if you can say, you know what, we don't have to let anybody in, then what would be wrong with saying, well, we're going to let some people in, but not people who are coming from a particular nationality or a particular religious background? I'm going to wear my philosopher's hat and do something a little annoying, and that is read a little bit, because I want to make sure I get the views that I'm going to try to push back against. I want to make sure that I'm explaining them well. But let me first just say that, so I just said that in light of the widespread view that states are able to kind of control their own borders, and they're at their sole discretion as to whether to admit somebody or not to admit somebody, the question or any concerns that might be raised by any sorts of restrictions or religious or racial screens seems like it's a surprising sort of worry to have, right? It's a mysterious kind of worry to have. So if you have the right to deny all admission, then why would any selection criteria be morally wrong? A couple of prominent political philosophers who are working on these issues, I'm going to refer to their views quite a bit because their views are sort of the foil to the view that I want to try to develop. They say that, look, if we consider domestic associations, domestic membership societies, the question about what's wrong with racial or religious kinds of screens isn't as puzzling as it first seems. Prominent political philosopher, his name is Christopher Wellman. As he puts it, quote, most of us take it for granted that even if a business is not required to hire anyone, it may not adopt a policy to hire only whites. And if a company cannot select employees in this way, presumably a state may not screen potential applicants in this way either. Okay, so even for people who think that states have the right to close their borders, they think, no, we still have to contend with this issue about racial or religiously motivated sorts of screens. To assess the strengths and weaknesses of a bunch of different views that I'm going to try to quickly go through, I'm going to limit the analysis to explicit screens. A screen, an immigration restriction that would say something like, we are not allowing Muslims in. Okay? That is an explicit screen. That's a pretty exaggerated example of an explicit screen. And I'm not suggesting that's what we have right now with the current executive order, but that's the kind of thing I have in mind. Okay. And also the existing literature that's concerned with this topic, they're mainly concerned with racial or ethnic criteria. So a lot of my examples are going to focus there. And I think it's a good place to start, if for no other reason than we sometimes think there are exceptions to having religious screens in the domestic context, but we almost never think there are exceptions to having racial screens in the domestic context. Starting with the view of two prominent political philosophers. So they provide a response to the question of whether there's anything morally wrong with something like a racial or religious immigration screen. And their answer appeals not to what a state has to do in terms of its obligations to non-members, or those people that would like to be like to come in, but rather in terms of the duties a state has to its own members. Okay, so Christopher Wellman, for example, thinks it's impermissible to deny admission based on race or religion because it would disrespect fellow members who share that race or religion. So the reason why he would say the executive order, insofar as he finds the executive order morally problematic, the reason why he would find it morally problematic is not because of what it says or does or harms or wrongs non-members, but because he would say something like, well, we have a big Muslim population in the US, and it wrongs our current Muslim population. Okay. In a similar vein, but focusing only on race or ethnicity, another prominent political philosopher by the name of Michael Blake argues that a state with a racial immigration policy makes a public statement of racial preference, and he thinks that could compromise the self-respect of members who happen to share the same racial category. So for people like these, for theorists like Michael Blake and Wellman, racial and religious exclusion is morally wrong not because it disrespects the rejected applicants, but because it disrespects our fellow members who also share the race or religion of the disfavored immigrants. Right. So what if, however, there are no current members in the particular racial or religious category? So in large multinational states, that's pretty implausible, right? But in very small nation states, it could be possible. And so I'm going to make another annoying philosopher's move for the second and imagine such states, imagine these hypothetical states where there really is no current population who would be wronged by these immigration restrictions. Before I give my example, one of these authors also considers these selective immigration policies in such a circumstance, but he doesn't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with them. So here's a sort of example that Michael Blake considers. He says, and this is case 1, he says, an ethnically homogeneous state with an immigration policy designed to ensure and perpetuate this ethnic makeup of society. All right, so he believes that we're not going to find anything wrong with the employment of categories like ethnicity or race in this sort of example, since there are no current members who are going to be wronged by the relevant immigration policy. So I think that this example does potentially reveal something about certain immigration criteria in particular contexts, but not in the way that this author thinks. But I think that the difference can begin to be illuminated by considering other cases. So let me just say a little bit about case 1, the case that this other author, Michael Blake, considers. It's, in important ways, it's void of any real-world content. So I think this means we're free to consider this hypothetical state in any way we want. And I want us to consider cases or examples that in our current world track the wrong attached to screening out particular racial and religious groups. And by doing so, I think we can better explain the reason that using selective criteria is wrong when it is wrong. Okay. So consider these other examples. Case 2. A homogeneous state composed only of white members decides to admit people of every race except for black people. I'm not talking about, I'm not going to be using the term African American. I'm going to be using the term black people because that African Americans don't live all over the world. Black people do, and white people do. And we're talking about a state composed only of white members. So they decide to admit people of every race except for black people. Case 3, a large multinational state composed of members of every major world religion except for Islam decides to admit people of every religion except for Muslims. Okay, so these are the kinds of cases that I want us to think about for just a second. Okay, so there's no current population that's going to be wronged by the relevant immigration policy, right? Since in each case, the state bans the admission of either all black people or all Muslims, and there's no current black or Muslim population in those. Yet each of these cases seems manifestly wrong. Let me just say this. If you think that case 2 and case 3 are wrong, then I think what they do and what case 1 failed to do is make visible both what the relevant immigration policy looks like and which particular prospective migrants would fall into the excluded category. I think that's obvious. So all we know about the immigration policy in case 1 is that it's, quote, designed to ensure and perpetuate the ethnic makeup of the state. So presumably this policy would only admit those sharing the current ethnicity, and all other ethnic categories are going to be excluded. But I think this presents some potentially important contrasts with these 2 other cases. So first, contrary how one group is singled out for a disadvantage in cases 2 and 3, in case 1, only one group of people benefits, right? Those sharing the ethnicity of the existing population. All other ethnic groups are in the same excluded boat, so to speak. But maybe more importantly, ethnic and racial categorizations are sometimes interchangeable and overlapping, and maybe both are problematic, not least because they might fail to capture actual distinctions between people. But it seems that we're more likely to think that ethnicity, when it's not a mere proxy for race, can track potentially meaningful cultural differences between people. So cultural selection, for example, could be based in considerations like shared language and shared social practice. And ethnicity might pick out those differences between people. Even if there are reasons to object to drawing those kinds of lines, it's not abhorrent in the way that racial selection is, or that racial selection generally is. And maybe we can talk about potential exceptions to that during Q&A. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, since all we're told about the policy in case 1 is that it's designed to ensure and perpetuate the state's existing population, and nothing more, I think we're going to find ourselves thinking, oh, well, it's protecting a vulnerable ethnic group, right? It's trying to ensure the existence of some very minority ethnic group in the world, maybe even one that's experienced persecution. And I think that's going to look very different. I think that's going to look very different than a state that seeks to preserve the purity of a majority racial group that enjoys a powerful standing in the world. And I think the lack of information in case one simply makes it much harder to condemn the state's immigration policy. However, to explain any differences in our judgments with respect to case one and these other two cases, we cannot appeal to explanations that put any wrong done to current members front and center. That's because structurally they're all the same. There are no current members who are going to be wronged in any of these cases. If we think that cases 2 and 3 are wrong, we need to look elsewhere for an explanation, and possibly an explanation for the difference between case 2 and 3 on one hand and case 1 on the other hand. So I think on reflection, it seems obvious that the wrong of certain exclusions is not dependent on the demographic makeup of a state's current population. I do think that a racial or religious exclusion policy would wrong a state's current members in the disfavored race or religion. So let me just make that clear. I do think that's the case. But it does not seem to be the only reason, or even the primary reason, that if we think these kinds of policies are wrong, that they are wrong. So consider how the explanation offered by these other authors rests on the fact that some category of members is disfavored. So they do suggest the deeper reason that disfavoring people is wrong is because it fails to accord them equal respect. And in a society, we owe other members of our society equal respect. But they don't explain, even in broad terms, whether there is anything particularly wrong about excluding people or disrespecting people on the basis of their race. Without explaining what is distinctive about race, it seems that basing exclusion on any category under which fellow members fall would also disrespect current members in those categories and thus be a wrong kind of action. So, for instance, excluding fans of tennis might be impermissible. So, like if we had an immigration screen that said no tennis fans are allowed to come in, but we have current tennis fans as members in our society, that would be wrong, okay? Or it could be wrong under the kind of explanation for what is wrong with these sorts of screens that these other authors have given us. I don't believe that either of those authors is going to say that there's anything morally important about being a tennis fan. So let me just be clear about that. I don't think they would. Presumably, they're going to want to say, no. We're not going to attach any moral significance to sports preferences. Okay, so just because you happen to be a fan of a tennis team and we exclude fans of that tennis team, that doesn't mean we're disrespecting current members who are fans of the tennis team. So they're probably not going to say that, right? They're going to say, no, race is different. But we need an explanation. We need an explanation for why race is different and why religion might be different. An intuitively plausible idea, okay, is that in our world, race is a socially salient identity constitutive trait, whereas being a tennis fan is not, or at least not typically. As alluded to before, just a few minutes ago, race in particular has been the locus of considerable and often baseless social and political differentiation. And consequently, members of certain races have experienced oppression and, in fact, enslavement at the hands of other races. But once we have reasons for race's distinctiveness, I think we have reasons for thinking it's a morally important category for any person, regardless of whether they're a current member or not. And that rejecting someone membership because of her race wrongs her specifically, and maybe only indirectly wrongs other people. The message of rejection, after all, is directly addressed to the rejected person. And only indirectly to anybody sharing that race. And it's also the non-member who's denied the opportunity for membership. The member already has membership, right? Okay. So a similar point, I think, applies to religion, which is, especially for the devout, is identity constitutive. It's a part of who they are. It's a part of their very identity, right? The current U.S. policies restricting entry from 7 or now it's 6, I think, in the second order. When I wrote this paper, when I started thinking about these issues, by the way, I was this was right on the cusp, right on the heels of the first executive order banning or restricting entry from 7 Muslim-majority states. We need to be careful to distinguish the travel bans from the immigration bans. So in this round of the executive order, there are no travel restrictions. Okay, so there are only immigration restrictions. It seems clear that when we did have travel ban, or when we did have travel restrictions, then that directly wronged members. People who hold green cards, for example, people who are permanent residents here and who happen to be overseas and couldn't get back into the country. Or maybe even people who hadn't yet not come here, but they were already given the privilege to come here. And then we barred them from coming. So they had certain rights that were at stake. And they had rights that as members of the US society should be respected. So insofar as the travel bans, or there are any travel bans like that, those are going to directly wrong any current members. But do the immigration bans, the issuance of new residence rights, okay, do they directly wrong current members? Or is it somebody else? Is it people overseas? Is it the non-members they wrong? So in answering this question, it's going to be really difficult to set aside the current circumstances. So for many Muslim members, especially non-citizens in this country, I think there's now a climate of uncertainty that has been largely fostered by the initial sudden execution of the ban, coupled with some of the background views of those in power and some of their previous public statements. But if those in power had instead made concerted and highly public efforts to assure the existing Muslim population that their membership, their rights, their belonging was secure, then that might have significantly lessened any offense. And we can maybe even imagine somebody who had never made those kinds of statements in the background, maybe on the campaign trail, for example. Maybe imagine former President Obama. If he had implemented a similar kind of executive order, would it have necessarily caused the kind of uncertainty, cause for thinking that other members didn't respect Muslim members? If he had implemented that kind of a ban, it's not clear that it would have. It's really not clear that it would have, or at least not to the same degree. But whether the immigration exclusions wrong Muslim members in general, I think is really contingent. And it's contingent on a lot of things. Contingent on whether they happen to be US citizens or whether they're just visa holders. It's contingent on whether they are born in this country or they're born in one of the immigration restricted states. It's contingent on whether they speak English with an accent, whether they occupy a profession of high social status, whether they have family members in those states. It's contingent on a lot of different things. And that is fitting with the idea that they're only indirectly wronged, right? So to some people, they might not feel any offense. They might not be feeling any kind of disrespect or message of disrespect from other members of society. And let me just say that I think an interesting and encouraging observation about the recent immigration order is that a lot of time there were expressions of respect and welcomeness that were sometimes primarily addressed to non-members. And I found it pretty illuminating. I think it suggested that many people found it intuitive that non-members were at least also wronged. So for example, the messages were replete with references to the un-American or unfair nature of the ban, or its general violation of US policies. So now some of this was certainly directed inward towards other US members. But much of it also seemed concerned about the way the US is presenting itself to the rest of the world. Okay, so not just sort of how we're presenting ourselves to one another, but how we're presenting ourselves outwardly, how we're presenting ourselves to the rest of the world. So for example, many people seem worried, and for the non-members themselves, not about any messages indirectly sent to members, about the fact that refugees from the banned states were being turned away. And the distinction, remember I made this distinction between discretionary and immigrants and people who have urgent claims, that's not going to completely account or give us an explanation for some of these worries. Because since all refugees count as non-discretionary immigrants, it could be problematic to exclude any of them, depending upon whether a state is meeting its fair share of taking in refugees. But insofar as the immigration order was selectively is interpreted as selectively targeting the group of Muslims, there seems to be something especially wrong with telling a group of refugees that they cannot come in because of their religion. Okay, that seems to be especially worrisome. All right. But in the absence of any Muslim members in a society, the explanation by some of those other authors that I mentioned earlier, it could not account for this. It couldn't give us an explanation. Because as long as the state were taking in its fair share of refugees, it would be free to say that it would only take in the non-Muslim refugees. So this other person, David Miller, he argues that certain immigration exclusions are going to primarily wrong the non-members that fall into the excluded category. So he agrees with me that it's the non-members that are primarily wronged. He maintains, though, that states do have the right to exclude discretionary immigrants. So outside of people who have non-urgent claims, we don't have to allow them in. But he also thinks that because people have strong interests at stake in immigration, they want to come here for good reasons, even though they're not urgent reasons, he thinks that liberal democratic states, which is what the U.S. is, we have an obligation to give reasons for our criteria for selection. And he thinks that you do not have the right race, quote unquote, would fail to count as a relevant reason. So he locates the problem in the same way that I locate the problem, okay? So he says these categorical exclusions, or exclusions based on categories like race, primarily wrong non-members. So it seems like he's able to say that case 2 and 3 are objectionable. Okay, so it seems like he's going to be able to say that. But the concern I have is how we're supposed to determine what counts as a relevant reason for excluding people. What counts as a relevant or good reason? And in particular, how this is going to fit with the broader view of states' rights that he thinks states have. So he thinks states have rights to exclude all discretionary immigrants. Okay? So we can just say, no, sorry, we're not going to allow anybody in. But then he says, but wait a minute, we can't, even though we can say we're not going to allow anybody in, if we want to exclude somebody because of their race, or if we want to exclude anybody at all, we have to give them a reason. Okay? And that reason cannot be of the sort, well, you don't have the right race or religion. But why? Why can't we say that? Now, to be clear, I don't believe that we can or we ought to say that. My concern is rather, how does that fit with the view that he proposes about the rights of states? So let me try to illuminate this. Okay, consider the position that it's at the discretion of property owners to allow or deny others onto their property. Okay, so now imagine a scenario where someone would like to start a business harvesting rare specialty herbs. Okay, and that requires a particular combination of soil, sun, fertile or sun exposure and rain and all those things. And the only nearby land suitable for the purpose belongs to a local homeowner. Okay? And she owns several acres of land. So the herb farmer goes to her to request permission to use a small part of her land. So he has a strong interest in pursuing his business activities of growing these rare specialty herbs. Even still, I don't think we're going to think that the farmer is owed an explanation from the homeowner if the homeowner just says, no, I'm sorry, I'm denying your request. It might be impolite if she said nothing, right? We might expect her to say, okay, I'm sorry, you know, I know you want to use part of my land here, but really it's my land. So we'd expect maybe her to say something to be polite, right? Not just close her door on the person. Okay, but that's it. That's all we would expect her to say. We wouldn't expect her to say anything else. Nor would we think that she's wronging the farmer who wants to use her private land. we wouldn't think that she's wronging that person by turning them away. It doesn't seem like she owes them any reason. It's simply her right to refuse. Things would be different if urgent interests were at stake. Okay, if the farmer needed access to her land to grow food to feed himself. But that's not the kind of case we're thinking about. And that's not the case, the kind of cases that we're thinking about when we're concerned with discretionary immigrants. There are no urgent stakes. Okay? So if a state, if a property owner can just say, I'm sorry, this is my land, why can't a state say that? Under the view that states are at their sole discretion to admit people or exclude people, why can't they simply say, I'm sorry, this is our country, no, you can't come in, and not say anything else? It might be stupid of them to do that, okay? It might get them into sort of international political turmoil. It might not make for very good diplomatic relationships between people coming from those states, right? Or the leaders of those states. There might be a lot of pragmatic reasons that states should say something more than I'm sorry, but this is our country. But in terms of their moral responsibility, they don't owe an explanation any more than the private homeowner owes an explanation to the person who wants to come use her land to grow their crops. David Miller, the guy I'm criticizing right now, he's going to stress that the obligation to offer a reason to denied or excluded non-members only kicks in, okay, only obtains when a state decides to admit some of them but exclude others. Okay, so it's only when there's selective admissions. So we're going to admit some but exclude others. That's when he's going to say, well, see, now that's when you have to give a reason. I've surveyed 2 different views, okay, about what makes certain immigration exclusions wrong. The first view, that of Blake and Wellman, they maintain that these exclusions are wrong because they wrong fellow members who share the disfavored category. But this view could not condemn racial or religious bans in cases like 2 and 3. And also, if we thought there were any differences between 2 and 3 on the one hand and 1 on the other, it could not give us an explanation for why. And also, once we elaborate on why certain traits like race, remember, seem morally important, whereas other traits like being a tennis fan does not seem morally important, we're better able to appreciate the idea that these traits, like race, at least in the world that we know, are going to be important no matter who they belong to, whether they're members or non-members. So the second view we just surveyed, that of Miller's. This is the competing view. This is the second view that we just looked at. This second view that we looked at said, well, we have to give reasons if we're going to include some and exclude others. But I just tried to illustrate that that's not a very plausible view if you think that states are at their sole discretion to exclude everybody, to exclude anybody they want. I believe there's a more straightforward explanation for why certain identity-based exclusions are wrong. And I think it better captures our intuitions about different kinds of cases. So we can begin to see the explanation if we return to where we started. The fact that we generally believe racial exclusions or racial screens are wrong in the domestic context. Okay, so in this setting, it seems we have 2 main models for our moral assessment. Regarding racial exclusions, by the way, I don't think that these are the only available moral models for how we think about these things, but I think they're the most likely, the most common ways we think about these things. And we can maybe talk about alternative models in Q&A. Okay, so the first one says racial screens. Now remember, we're in the domestic context now. Okay, so I'm thinking about when a particular domestic association, society, business wants to impose racial screens. These are the 2 different ways that we have for thinking about them, or how we most commonly think about them. The first way says the exclusions, or those screens, they're impermissible. Morally speaking, they are wrong. The second one says, well, they're objectionable in some way. Okay, this is B, but they're not impermissible. They're not wrong. Even if you already think that the racial exclusions by states is wrong, impermissible, I think it'll be instructive to investigate the domestic examples where we think this is so to see why it's similar to states. Let's start by considering examples that meet A, that are more like A. So recall the earlier comments about how we take it for granted that even if a business society or a business is not required to hire anyone or admit new members at all, new employees at all, it's still not permitted to have a whites-only hiring policy. So to pick an especially strong case, imagine a large company that controls a significant market share in a major industry. Okay? And it wants to implement a policy of hiring only whites. So it seems clear that we're going to regard this kind of policy as morally wrong. But we need to ask why. So the first thing I want to ask is where we locate the wrong. The question is a whites-only hiring policy wrong because of how it disrespects the business's current employees or shareholders or management? Well, what if there are no current non-white employees? What if none of the shareholders are non-white? There might be some secondary concerns about that, right? If none of the current employees if all the current employees are white, then it doesn't seem like that's where we're going to be able to say the wrong is located. So I think it seems obvious. The policy is wrong in the first place because of how it wrongs non-white people who would attempt or who do attempt to gain employment at that company. So in other words, it wrongs non-members, right? So I'm using employees as sort of the analogy to members of a state. So it wrongs the company's non-members, people who would like to be a part of the company, but they're denied in virtue of their race. And note that this is not merely a legal prohibition. So in countries like ours, we have strong laws against the use of racial screens in a variety of activities, including hiring, but also college admission, all sorts of things. But this does not mean that not for these laws, we would think that a racial policy is completely permissible. We're still going to find it wrong. Racial screens just may not be used in hiring because they wrong those who are excluded from employment because of their race. Now, the nature of the wrong, exactly how it wrongs people who are excluded from getting employment in that company because of their race, that's still up for grabs, and I haven't said anything about that yet. Could be that it demeans them. It could be that it denies them an opportunity that others have available to them. But I'm not as concerned about that as I am with, again, trying to unpack the broader framework of what all this means, at least when it comes to businesses. We do not think that the reason a racial screen in hiring is wrong is because of how it wrongs current employees. It's because of how it wrongs people who would like to be employees. In other words, the non-members. You're probably thinking, well, there are important differences between states and businesses, right? There's a lot of important differences. Okay, so to begin exploring whether and to what extent states are like businesses in the morally relevant ways, I want to consider the alternative model of moral assessment. Okay, B. The exclusions are objectionable in some way, so racial or religious-based exclusions are objectionable in some way, but not wrong. I think in even better cases, marriage and other romantic partnerships. These are the associations and relationships, in which we think the scope of our freedom in choosing fellow companions or choosing fellow members is the greatest. And I think there's good reason for that. We attach a lot of significance to the intimacy of the relationships. If someone were to deny another person's marriage proposal in virtue of their race, okay, so my husband happens to be white, but imagine I said to a white person, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to marry you because you're white. I'm only going to marry fellow brown people. Now, maybe it doesn't work as well in that direction as it might in the reverse direction. Imagine a white person who says, I'm sorry, I'm not going to marry you because you're brown. Sorry, it's my right, right? They're able to say that. They're allowed to say that. And I think there's nothing wrong with them saying that. Or at least there's nothing impermissible about them saying that. They're still entitled to do it, even if there's something kind of nasty about their character. Okay? And I'm not saying in all cases there would be something bad about their character that is revealed. Extending this kind of model, B, I think is going to take us further than what was suggested before, because it at least allows us to say that there's something morally objectionable about case 2 and 3. But is it a plausible frame for thinking about states? So a preliminary concern that I have is that it's difficult to make sense of exactly how the thought would go. So it's one thing to say that an individual who refuses a marriage proposal or entry onto their property on grounds of race, say, has objectionable moral character. But what would it mean to say this about a state or any really large group of people? I think there are significant reasons to think that A is a much better characterization of our relevant judgments pertaining to states. And this is because states resemble in significant ways the sorts of examples that are characterized by A. So consider the differences between associations that fit A and those that fit B. Large businesses on the one hand and marriages on the second. So first is the character of the interests at stake for the admitting party. In marriage, as I mentioned before, the interests are in flourishing, intimate relationships. And I think we rightly and obviously attach considerable moral weight to those. But that requires that people are free to choose who they're going to be close with. No matter how reprehensible someone's beliefs about the race of a potential partner, the interest in having thriving personal and intimate and potentially lifelong relationships, I think, is compelling enough to secure their right to choose on whatever grounds they want. In contrast, the interests at stake for employers are things like productivity, efficiency, achievement, depending upon the kind of position, depending upon the kind of the hiring institution. We don't need to identify exactly what the interests are for businesses to see the relevant point, which is they're not intimate interests. They're not appropriately intimate interests, right? Businesses are not hiring people to have relationships with them. They're hiring people to work for them. So sometimes there might be common bonds that are necessary. So I do want to note that sometimes common bonds, even friendships or social bonds, personal interaction is important for a company to be able to really flourish, to really try to manufacture the product or provide the particular service to its customers in the best possible way. It's going to be important that there are certain kinds of common bonds between fellow employees. But it's unlikely, very unlikely, that race is going to matter for those bonds. Okay? The second difference between the kinds of examples I think that fit A and those that fit B has to do with the power of the kind of association we're talking about. All right, which is closely connected to what the rejected party is denied. In particular, what are the other available opportunities for the type of good that the association represents? So loving close relationships are really important, right? But we have presumably ample opportunities to pursue those. If somebody denies your marriage proposal, they don't thereby structure your access to other kinds of relationships. On the other hand, in the case of a large private company, options, meaning alternative options, really start to narrow. Powerful businesses, whether monopolistic or not, shape access to employment options in the industries that they occupy. And efforts to start new businesses in these industries are going to face significant startup costs, often informal startup costs, so like high fixed costs. Sometimes they're going to be legal startup costs, licenses or intellectual property rights. But there are going to be a lot of barriers to entry. Which way do states resemble? On these two dimensions, the interests at stake for the admitting party and also the power that they control in structuring opportunities for the rejected party. What kind of picture do states resemble? Is it like marriages, or is it more like large businesses? I think it's probably safe to say that for both those issues, the normative picture of states not only looks much more like that of large businesses than marital associations, but that states are going to stand even further from marriages than large businesses will. Okay, so first, the interests at stake are not intimate. They're not even personal or social. They're not remotely intimate, right? In contrast, We've seen that some businesses might require some social interaction between members, but it's not clear that states require direct, personal interaction between members, or at least we don't all interact with one another, right? But sometimes in a business, that's important, that there's at least a meet and greet or something like that, maybe a couple times a year, Christmas party, or at the beginning of somebody's employment. There's nothing like that in states. We don't have that where we meet everybody else in the state. Sometimes the values of companies vary considerably, and there are often very contentful goals and targets arising from the nature of the good or the service produced or sold. So compare Tyson's Foods with Beyond Meat. Tyson's Foods is one of the world's leading meat manufacturers. Beyond Meat is one of the world's leading manufacturers of alternative plant-based meats. They have drastically different values. Do we find those same kinds of contentful goals and values across liberal democratic states? It's not clear that we do. I do want to stress that sometimes we do need some kind of shared commitment to certain sorts of values. All right, so like mutual respect, equality, autonomy. These shouldn't be minimized. But these values are arguably a lot thinner. And in any case, like a business or corporate culture, the extent to which one embraces or even respects a political culture hardly depends on one's race. So as to the second difference, and I'll stop after this, as to the second difference, a state not only structures, but controls access to a range of important life and identity shaping opportunities. And there are extraordinary, if not insurmountable, startup costs or barriers to entry to forming another state, right? We can't just go out and make another state. We can't do that. States collectively occupy all the territory on Earth, and they typically coercively enforce and restrict opportunities for seceding. So this means that we're rejected parties that want to come into a state. They're denied access to a range of important overlapping opportunities, not just employment, but geographic, cultural, economic, political, social, all those sorts of opportunities, and they cannot simply go out there and create an alternative for themselves. So I think both of these sorts of issues, the power that the association controls, or the power that the kind of association in question has over the opportunities for the rejected party, and also the interests at stake for the association, along both of these sorts of dimensions, states are just an amplified model of large businesses. These two facts do tend to align, by the way, with our judgments concerning the use of a bunch of identity-based criteria by domestic private associations and institutions even beyond large businesses. So including colleges, trade unions, and social clubs with lucrative networking options. So things like the Junior Chamber of Commerce or the JCs or the Augusta National Golf Club. We can talk about those. As an association becomes larger and less structured around personal or face-to-face interactions, and membership becomes more connected to access to a range of important life-shaping opportunities, the more obviously wrong it seems for the association to engage in racial, religious, or other identity-based exclusion. So I think all of this points to A as the appropriate moral assessment for states. I have a whole other section that I need to get to, but I'm not going to be able to. I'm going to stop there. But I think there's enough there to talk about, and probably enough to disagree with, that we can have a meaningful discussion. Because we're a democratic society, our interests are affected, right? We have certain rights. We're entitled to vote. We're entitled to a say in our government's policies. So that's easily accountable within this kind of a framework. But does Trump owe reasons, good reasons, bad reasons, whatever kinds of reasons, to the people who want to come here? It's hard to see why he would, under the kind of view that says each individual state can control its membership all on its own.
You spend this time basically showing that it's wrong morally or not wrong morally and explaining that, and you stated the problem, what would be the solution?
So what do you mean? Do you mean where I think ultimately this view is going to take us? So what are the implications?
Either way,
How to fix it.
how to fix it or where it's going to lead us, whichever's easiest for you to explain.
So I think where it's going to lead us is to say that third parties have a say in our membership policies. All right, so that's where the next step in my argument goes, is to say just like a business cannot completely determine its membership all on its own. Third parties have a say, namely the rest of us in our society. Okay? Yes, we are in the same society, so you might think, well, that's why we have a say. But I think that there's a similar kind of argument to be made for why third parties have a say in states' membership policies. So now who are those third parties? It could be international institutions. It could be through bilateral or multilateral agreements. It could be other states. It could be all sorts of things. So I'm not necessarily going to specify what the policy or the international framework ought to look like. But it does mean that other parties have a say in our membership. It's not just up to all of us. It's not just up to all US citizens. And that's the really provocative part that I'm not able to get to.
Discretionary
Under the dominant framework in the way we think about states today, right? I don't think we even have to say that much. I don't think we even owe that much to somebody who wants to commit. We don't even owe them that kind of an explanation to say, you know what, we understand you would like to come here and work here, but we have a large labor force and we want to ensure that there are available jobs for them. I don't happen to think that kind of an explanation is a good explanation anyway. So if that's what you're asking.
like you're saying that we don't have to reply like a reason, but we do have the right to say that we don't want you to come into our country.
You think that states are at their discretion to exclude all discretionary immigrants, then yeah, I don't think you have to even provide them a reason. So that's why I don't think states are at their discretion.
So, but thank you all again for coming out again. Drop your